How's it going? Thanks for coming by. Today, I'm going to share a little bit with you of the beginning steps. So I told you that I've been developing a personal application, just kind of like playing around with Zend-expressive and also playing around with Doctrine, ORM a little bit. As well as some other libraries and packages. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover the beginnings, right? In the beginnings, when we're first starting to create something, one of the first steps is we have to create a development environment, someplace that we're able to play around in, be able to test using a web server, because we're going to be using PHP. We do need a web server for that. So one of my first steps is setting up a development environment. Now, one of the first things I do when I'm setting up a development environment is, of course, I turn to Composer. So looking at that, Composer, for those of you, I know that there are some people out there that are still not using Composer. Sad to say, but I do know that it's happening because some of the companies that I deal with, some of the developers that I see out there, they're still not using Composer. You should really be using Composer for your projects. Now, that being said, I realize, let me bring up on my screen here. So here on my screen now you can see the place where you download and install Composer, and all the documentation related to Composer is at getcomposer.org. So going to getcomposer.org, you can see how to get started. You can see, in addition to that, you can also see how to download it and what that looks like, using it from a command prompt, using it with PHP and a command prompt, and getting Composer up and started. Now, that being said, you do, of course, need to have PHP installed locally to run Composer, or wherever you're going to use Composer. If you're going to use it on a server, if you're going to use it on your local development environment, or even a Docker container or something like that, you're going to need PHP. So one of the first steps is to install PHP. Now, I'm not going to cover that in this video. What I am going to do is cover the development environment as if PHP is already installed, because on my local environment, PHP is already installed. If I go to a command prompt, for instance, and I type php-v, I can see that I actually do have PHP 7.2.10 installed. So I'm ready to go. I'm ready with PHP. So from there, I can use Composer. Now, some other small notes on Composer. Again, you should be using Composer for your projects. I encourage you to use it for its auto-loading capabilities. Excuse me, if for nothing else, but I also encourage folks to take advantage of other software that's out there. Usually when I do run into developers or companies who are not using Composer, usually they're also not using a framework, or they're also not using some other mainstream packages out there. Instead, they're creating the code all on their own. There's no reason to do that. Don't be afraid of other people's code. Now, I do say that with a caveat, right? You want to make sure that you're at least verifying the packages to make sure they are quality packages, make sure they're mainstream, make sure they're being used by a lot of people, maintained by a lot of people. Don't introduce any security risks and so forth. But if you're able to use a package from somebody else that saves you from writing thousands of lines of code all on your own, then why not do that? Packagist or since PHP 5.3, we've had namespaces, and that's kind of when Packagist came about. Packagist actually started in 2011. After PHP 5.3 was introduced, and since then it's just become huge. Most developers are using Composer, and most developers are using Packagist for public code bases. On the accompanying website for Composer, Packagist.org, this is the place where open source contributors and other libraries out there, they put the information so that it can be used by Composer. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, we can kind of see some of the statistics behind Composer. For instance, we can see that at the moment here, it's 1.5 million packages or versions currently being served up through Packagist.org. for Composer, and that's just huge, right? Not only that, we can also see some of the other statistics, like the average number of packages installed. If we look here. We can see, let me lift my glasses so I can see better. I have a tough time seeing my screen with my glasses on, so they're gone. Now I can see great. So we can see that the number of packages installed is about 500 million per month. 500 million per month. And if we look at the lifetime of packages, we can see that packages installed total around 12.2 trillion. At 12.2 trillion, that is huge since 2012. So Packagist is really being used. Composer is also really being used. I encourage all developers to use it if you're not. Now, I'm not going to say much more on that because most people are using it, but just know that if you're not, you should be. We're also going to be using Docker environments. So when I set up a local dev environment, I'm usually doing it one of three ways. I'm usually either using my local web server, using Apache locally, and have a LAMP environment set up on my laptop. Or I'm using Vagrant and using VirtualBox to create a virtual environment and using Vagrant for my development. Or even more recently, I'm using Docker containers and housing my application inside a Docker container, doing my development locally. But I have the code on my local hard drive actually served into the Docker container using a volume. So that way, the Docker container I'm able to use to get the web server up and running, but it's thinking that the code is inside the Docker image or Docker container, but it's actually on my local hard drive through the use of volumes in Docker. And that's usually the way that I work. So that's how I'm going to work as I'm showing you my development environment that we're going to be using for this series of videos that I have coming up. Now, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to create a small little Zend-expressive application. And you can find Zend-expressive at Zend. If you do a search for Zend-expressive on Google, it will bring you to this page, which is a Zend Framework documentation, but to the Zend-expressive area of the documentation. And in there, they give you the command here with Composer, you're able to do Composer, create -project. That's the command that you pass to Composer, and then we're telling it to use the zend-expressive-skeleton application, and we're going to put the application in a subdirectory from our current location called expressive. So what I'm going to do to get started is I'm just going to copy and paste this command. Go over to my command line. I'm already in the projects directory. If I look at my present working directory, I can see that I'm in home/Adam-Culp/projects. I'm going to go ahead and copy that command or paste that command in here. So again, we have Composer, we have create project, and then we're telling it zend-expressive/zend-expressive-skeleton, and we're going to put it in a subdirectory called expressive. So let's go ahead and kick that off. Now, as I kick it off, what it's going to do is it's going to reach out to Packagist, say, where do I find this Zend-expressive-skeleton? And it's going to download that and get the beginner there. Now, Zend-expressive-skeleton application, the way that it works is it actually has an installer, and it's going to walk you through various things because Zend-expressive is a micro framework. It is a middleware micro framework, and as such, you can use a lot of different things with it. You're not locked into a full stack framework where you have to use certain bits and pieces. The installer that comes with the skeleton application allows you to choose for amongst some certain things that are already recommended. They've already got some plumbing built into them. One of the first questions we can see on the screen right here is it's asking what type of installation we want to use. Do we want to use a minimal, which means there is no default middleware, there's no templating and no assets, nothing at all. Do we want to use a flat structure or do we want to use a modular structure? Now, I like having modules. I like having my code separated into modules, so if I wanted to remove some functionality or introduce functionality, all I have to do is add a new module, and it allows me to namespace things out a lot more cleanly. So I'm going to go ahead and select number 3. So that way we'll use a modular structure for this sample application that I'm going to be creating. Next thing it asks is, what container would you like to use? And again, it offers a lot in here. It offers Errata.di, offers Pimple, Zend Service Manager, offers Arin, Symfony.di, as well as PHP.di. Now, I'm going to use Zend Service Manager because I'm kind of partial to that. It's a very nice service manager, very robust, very, I really like a lot of the features in Zend Service Manager. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. The next thing it asks is, what router do you want to use? So how do you want the routing to happen in your application? Do you want to use Ara.router? Do you want to use FastRoute? Do you want to use Zend router? Now, in this case, I like FastRoute. FastRoute it's fast and it's really easy to use. FastRoute uses regular expression to figure out what routes or how your routes resolve. And so I'm going to go ahead and select number 2, which is FastRoutes in this case. And then we go to the next stage of the installation for the Zend skeleton or the expressive skeleton application, and that is, what templating engine do we want to use? Now it's offering me here, I have plates, I have twig, I have Zend View, which also makes a note that you do need the service manager in order to use Zend View, or you could select none. Now, in my case, I'm going to build this sample application. It's going to be a REST API. So I don't really have a need for a view. I'm going to be outputting JSON from this sample application. So I'm going to go ahead and put an N in there because I'm going to select none. And then the final step is, it's asking, what type of error handler would you like to use? Really, there's only one offered, which is Whoops. Whoops is quite amazing. It really gives some good feedback to you in when you have errors happening in your application. So now this is for development only. So I'm going to go ahead and select Whoops. Now, if it was not, if you didn't want any error handling at all, if you wanted to create your own or whatever the case might be, then of course you could select none there. But I'm going to select Whoops because I like the feedback we get from there. After we do that, of course, Composer is calling back to Packagist and saying, hey, where do I find these packages? Packagist then tells Composer where it can find those packages on GitHub or where they're housed. And then it goes through and installs every one of those. Now, if we scroll up here, we can see all the different packages that were installed. And the nice thing is using Composer, I don't have to worry about this. It's done for me. It tells me the versions of every one of these packages, and it also tells me if the package recommended some additional things, right? Or is each package recommending maybe some additional packages? So now that that's done, I'm going to okay, let me clear that off. Okay, so now I noticed that in the directory that I'm working in, there is now an expressive subdirectory, because of course that's what I told Composer. Install the Zend skeleton application and install it in a subdirectory for expressive. And that's exactly what it did. So I'm going to go ahead and change the directory into the expressive directory. And in here we see that we do have, in fact, the entire application installed for us. It's here. Composer built all that for us. Also, it built a composer.json and a composer.lock file. Now the composer.json, if we look at that, if we look at the composer.json, we can see that there is, in fact, a lot of information here. It's going to give the name of the application. Now, I can completely change this, and I'm going to be changing it a little bit because it's my application now. Even though I use the zend-expressive-skeleton, I can change this because it's not the zend-expressive-skeleton anymore. It's my application on my local hard drive, and it's going to be served in a Docker container, but it's on my local hard drive, so I don't need to keep some of this information, right? This will become the name of my application, such as and maybe I want to come in and name it Adam Culp / whatever. And I can do that. We can also see some keywords. I might want to change those because, of course, my application doesn't need these keywords. I need the keywords to be more geared towards the application that I'm building. We can scroll down here. We can see the different requirements. We can see what requirements were pulled in, what Composer actually pulled in. Now, you might remember when we were looking just a little bit ago, there were a lot more packages that were brought in by Composer. And that is because these items also bring in other items with them. They have their own dependencies, and that's the magic of Composer. Composer looks at all the dependencies and brings all the dependencies in. And then we can also see the next area down is if there are in development, we have additional things we can bring in, right? So in a development environment, also bring in PHP unit, also bring in security advisories and PHP code sniffer, some other things, right? And you notice that whoops is also the last item in the list here because we asked to have it included as well. And we can also see the auto loading for development and everything else brought in. We can see that scripts, there's also a scripts area where there are maybe some command line scripts that we can use. And we see, development disabled, development enable, and development status. We're going to use those in just a minute, but just know that they're all here in Composer. So Composer brought those in for us. All right, let me go ahead and close that. So now we've got our install, but we don't really, I would have to set up a web server to serve this. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and use PHP's built-in web server, and we can do that in one of two ways. We can either use it via a Composer command, or we can use it with a PHP command. Composer has a nice little command built in that handles this nicely for us. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that in here. So I put in the command Composer. Now on my local environment, I don't have to call PHP composer.var because I have Composer actually in my path, right? I put it in user/bin, and so it makes Composer available from the command line. And so I'm doing Composer run. I'm telling it to do a 0 timeout, and I'm issuing the command serve. And what that's going to do is it is going to use the PHP command. You see on the next line, it does put up there PHP -S, and then 0.0.0.0:8080. So that's saying run a web server at that IP address for port 8080. And it's also telling it to run the document root from the public directory of my current location, right? Because the Zend skeleton application by default puts your front controller in the public directory. So now if I go over to my web browser, open up a new tab, and I type in localhost 8080, hit enter, and we can see that I actually do get a JSON return, because remember, I didn't load any views. So I get a JSON return saying, congratulations, you've installed zend-expressive-skeleton application. So that means that it's working. Now I am using PHP's built-in web server through Composer. So that's not really meant for production. It's not really meant for a heavy load or anything like that. But it's fine for development. It's fine for testing. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit Control C, and that's going to end that because I don't want that. What I want to do is I want to get a Docker instance up and running, or a Docker container for my local environment. I just wanted to run the PHP web server just to confirm that Zend-Expressive was in fact installed correctly, and that's in the documentation here on the Zend-Expressive website. If I go to the Quick Start walks you through this as well. So if you go to Zend-Expressive site, go to the Quick Start, you'll see they have the command here for Composer to install. Then they also have further down, they tell you how to run Composer run to test the local web server, and some other items there as well. Now, another thing that they also show you here is to be able to test for the development environment. Now, in this case, we are doing local development. So if I using Composer, I can issue this command, and so we'll do that here. So we will from the local directory, if I do Composer, development -status, for instance, because I want to see, okay, what is my current development status? I can see it returns development mode is enabled, right? So that means that zend-expressive-skeleton application is set into development mode. That means I'm going to have access to PHP unit and whoops and the other things that are available. Now, of course, in production, you wouldn't want to have development mode enabled. You would want it to be, production ready. But in this case, it's a development environment, so I'm glad to know that it's in there. Now, it's and that is by default when you install the Zend skeleton application or the expressive skeleton application. It defaults to being development mode enabled. And you would want to disable that. Prior to then pushing to production. Excuse me. All right, so now as one of the next things we want to do is since I want to set up this environment using Docker, I'm going to set up a docker-compose YAML file. I'm also going to set up or YML file. I'm also going to set up a schema file for the database because I want to use a database in my production or in my development. So let's do that first. Before I set up the Docker containers, let me go ahead and create that SQL file. Now, if I come over here to the command line, and if I do VI, I'm going to use VI editor. Now, throughout these videos, I'm not a big VI user. I know how to use VI, and I can do it quite well, but I'm actually going to be using an IDE. But today, because I'm going to be doing a lot of just raw files to get this up and running, I am using the terminal. I'm going to be editing the files in VI. So bear with me on that. In future videos, we'll be using actually PHP Storm because I do enjoy using PHP Storm for development. But today we're going to be using VI. So if I go into the data directory and let's see what's available there. I've got no files in there. So in the data directory, I'm going to go ahead and create a file called schema SQL. And schema SQL, I'm going to be using that, and as I'm bringing up the Docker containers, I want it to build my database from this schema. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that. Now, VI just creates the file, and now it's ready for me to put information in there. So I've got a schema file. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that and paste it over here. And so now I've got the contents of the file. Let me scroll up to the top because sometimes pasting gets a little bit finicky. So anyway, it seems like it went fine. So I'm going to go ahead and save that file. So I did VI, I did the I for insert mode. I copied and pasted into VI, and then I hit escape. So it got out of insert mode, and then I hit Shift ZZ, so basically two capital Z's, and that quits and saves while it's quitting. So those are some quick keyboard commands that I use along with that. So now I've got my schema file ready to help in creation of the database. The next thing I want to do is to start building the Docker files needed to build my containers. So I'm going to build, the first thing I'm going to use docker-compose to do this. So I want to create that new file. If I look at the current structure, I don't have a docker-compose in here. So I'm going to go ahead and do vi docker-compose. docker-compose.yml, and it's going to create that file and be ready for the contents. So in that file, let me just bring this over here. Okay, so what I've done is I'm telling it use version 2 of docker-compose. I'm going to build the first service that I'm going to build here is a web service. I'm going to call it web. I'm going to include the Docker file, which we have to create. We're going to create a Docker file in the subdirectory container build/web, and then we're going to create a file called Dockerfile. We're going to create that in just a minute, and it's going to use that Docker file to build this web service. Now I'm also putting in some environmental items in here for the MySQL database that we will be using. Now the MySQL database, I actually installed that in a separate service. We're going to get there in just a minute though. Now this service for web, I'm going to do port forwarding. So I'm going to be forwarding from port 8080 on my host machine. So that means when I open up in a browser and I go to a website inside the Docker container, I'm going to be using port 8080 on all my URLs. Inside the Docker container, it's going to translate that to port 80, right? Which is a standard web port. I'm setting up a volume at var /var/www, and what that's going to do is it's going to take the items from my current working directory. That's why there's a dot here at the beginning, and it's going to put that in /var/www inside the container. So that's how my current directory in the zend-expressive-skeleton application that we just finished installing, it's going to make that available inside the Docker container in var www. And then I'm also saying that the web server depends on DB. DB is another service that we're going to create farther down the file here. So we have DB. This is going to use the image MySQL for version 5.7. Now, these are images that are made publicly available. They're created and put out on Docker Hub and made available so that Docker Compose can pull those down. Kind of like we did with Packagist, where we were using Composer to talk to Packagist to find out packages to install and their dependencies. This is actually reaching out to Docker Hub for packages out there, and these packages are actually images that can be put into a Docker container and used this way. Now inside we're going to take port, the MySQL standard port is 3306. I'm saying that I want to map port 6603 from my local environment to port 3306 inside the container. So that way, if I wanted from a command line or from some sort of client for MySQL on my local system, if I wanted to hit the database inside the Docker container, I could do that through port 6603, and it would map that to the MySQL port. Standard inside the container. Now I'm also setting up the environment variables here for the I set up the root password. Now, in this case, I'm using very insecure passwords because these are just local containers that I'm just using for development. They're not going to go anywhere. So I'm just setting up, just plain old passwords, generic usernames, generic database names, things like that. An additional thing that I'm doing here is I'm setting up the volumes, and I'm setting it up to use a certain volumes inside the container for the MySQL data, and I'm telling it where to store the data, and that's all I'm really doing in this Docker Compose file. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So now we've got our Docker Compose. If I bring up, let me clear that and bring up that. Now we see that I actually do have a Docker Compose here in the directory for the application. Now, if you recall, in the Docker Compose, I'm actually saying that I have another file to use to help build the web server. And so let's go ahead and create that. And I said that I was going to create that. So I'm going to make the directory. I'm going to make the directory container build, right? So I'm going to create that directory, and we see that that now exists. So I'm going to change directory into that. And inside there, I'm going to make a subdirectory for web. So I'm going to make directory web. So now I have a web directory, and inside that web directory, that's where I'm going to put this Dockerfile that is going to help carry information on how to build the web server, right? So the Docker Compose is going to call this file. So again, I'm going to use vi, and I'm going to make Dockerfile. So I'm going to vi Dockerfile. It's going to open up, create a brand new file, and in there, I'm going to put some content. So let's start with this. I've got a couple pastes I'm going to need. So first I'm going to need that, and then I'm also going to need this, which I'm going to copy and paste in as well. Oop. There we go. I got some extra characters in there. Let me go clean those up. Okay, there. Now we're all set. So what I'm doing here is inside this Docker file, we're first of all saying start this container from the PHP image using PHP 7.2-Apache. PHP, of course, if you're using it with Apache, it works as a module of Apache. So we have to have Apache, right? We have to have Apache. So they have to be in the same container. PHP and Apache have to go together. So that's what we're doing. We're doing it from an image of that has Apache in it, and it's got PHP 7.2 version. Now, I've tried this before with 7.3, but I ran into some errors. Xdebug was kind of tripping up with it a little bit, so I fell back. For the sake of this video, I'm using PHP 7.2. Eventually, I would like to move to 7.3. It is available in production now, but like I said, for some reason, Xdebug was kind of funny with it, so we skipped that. Now, the first thing I'm doing is I'm selling it. I'm using this image. PHP 7.2 Apache uses Ubuntu as the operating system. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm running apt-get update, which says pull down any information from the various operating system repos to make sure we're able to do updates and things like that. Then I'm doing an installation. I'm telling it to install Git. I'm telling it to install some other libraries. I'm telling it to install the MySQL client because, of course, we're going to connect to a MySQL database, so we need the client to be installed. And then after that, I'm calling the command docker php ext install, which is for extension install. It's a PHP with these PHP prepackaged images. They're really nice. It's got a good command for installing packages. I'm telling it to install zip, install MySQLi, and install PDO MySQL. I'm also, after that, then we're doing peckle install xdebug, and then we're telling Docker to install the extension xdebug, which activates it inside the configuration. I have to do some additional things like add the Zend extensions for xdebug into our configurations. And then I also added some other items in here for xdebug settings because I want to make sure I allow for remote enable, so that way I'm able to debug from my environment on my host machine into the Docker container. So I need to turn on remote enable. Also need to turn on remote host, which is using the standard IP address that is going to be assigned to this container. I'm also doing remote auto start 0. Now, if I want to, in the case of doing debugging with the REST API, the reason that I included this is because with the REST API, you need to turn auto start on because, of course, you're not using a browser. Therefore, you're not sending the command to xdebug to go ahead and start the debug session. So remote auto start, we'll want to set that to on later when it comes time to do some debugging. But for right now, I'm putting it there as a placeholder, setting it to 0. I don't want it to turn it on automatically right now. And then I'm doing a remote callback equal to 1. Again, that's for the debugging when we get to a place where we might need to debug. I'm also turning on the rewrite module for Apache. So I'm passing the command for turning that on. Now you'll notice here a lot of these settings. Those of you who are used to working with a development environment on Ubuntu or something like that, you're probably used to running with sudo. And you most of these commands you have to use sudo apt-get update, sudo apt-get install, sudo a2 nmod rewrite. In this case, I'm not, and that is because in the container, we're going to be running as root. That's the default user. So when we're using the container, the default user is going to be root, and it's going to be issuing these commands. Therefore, we don't need to do sudo, right? So these commands are running as root already. And then you can see here that we're also doing some other settings for Apache to set it up. We're setting our document root for the web server, and then we're calling Composer, and we're telling Composer so that way Composer is available inside the container as well. If we wanted to issue Composer commands, then Composer is going to be installed there. I've been running Composer so far on my local machine because I have PHP installed, but I could run Composer inside this container, via the command line as well. And then the final command we're going to do is set our working directory of /var/www, which says, okay, now that we've finished all this stuff, go into this directory. And that's where it's going to end, right? That's where it's going to end. So let me go ahead and save this. That is our Docker file. So now with the Docker Compose and the Docker file created, as well as the schema being ready, now we're ready to actually kick off Docker. First, let me just check some things. No, that's okay. I should be fine. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm thinking through to make sure I got all my sequences down here, because I already did the zend-expressive-skeleton application install. So now I should be fine. So let me go ahead and let me clear my screen here, so we're starting fresh, and we will do docker compose and the up command. Now, if I do docker compose up without any additional commands, it's going to create the Docker containers, but then it's going to kind of leave the command prompt hanging. Because the web server is going to be hanging. But I don't want that. I want it to actually start the container and then give me my command line back after that. So I'm putting the -d in here because it's going to run daemonized. So this is going to run Docker daemonized after it's finished creating these containers. So issue that. And then, of course, it's going to go in and create. Now, this is very fast, and you'll notice that it created this container really fast. And that is because I've already ran this command before the video. So it already had the images downloaded. If I didn't do that beforehand, then you would have seen a lot of text scrolling on the screen as it created the PHP image, downloaded it, downloaded the MySQL image, for both of those from Docker Hub, and also creating my local image that's going to be used inside the container. So it would have taken a couple minutes for that, not a long time. It takes about 2 minutes maybe. At most, probably closer to 1 minute. 1 minute seems like a long time when you're counting seconds. But anyway, so that being said, since I already had those items created, Docker's done. Docker's running. So now if I do a Docker PS, you can see I actually do have two containers. I have this container with Expressive Web, and I have this container with the MySQL database. So they are already there. They're working. They're running. So now I should be able to come back over here. Now, remember, we don't have the internal web server running anymore, but I should be able to run this, and it will serve up. That's right. So there's one issue. As I was getting ready to do this video, I kind of tested this out a little bit. There's a bug in Deoctros right at the moment, so let's fix that. We're not actually going to have to fix the library, though. What I am going to do instead is I'm going to edit the composer. I'm inside the wrong directory. I need to get back to Expressive, and then I can VI the composer.json file, because this composer.json file is actually allowing a couple versions of zend-expressive-skeleton. Now, the version 2 at the moment, which it's loading here, and you can see it's saying load zend-expressive-skeleton version 171 or higher, or version 2 or higher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take off the 2, and we'll just go with 171 for now. Save that. I do have to run composer update, and it's going to downgrade the version of Deoctros from 2 back to 1.7, and that's fine. With version 2, they included some new static the new static types and things like that, and there was some bugs in there with some of the comparisons, and that error that we were getting is actually because it doesn't like the header inside the Docker image. So this header right here is being passed from the Docker image, and it didn't like that. So now I installed the other version, so it downgraded. It actually removed the HTTP factory, and it actually updated. It actually went down to 1.8.6 of Zend. So now if I come back here and I refresh this, there we go. We get a success because now we do have the Zend skeleton application running. So now we've gone through, we've got our development environment ready, we've got Zend skeleton application installed, and we're at a very good stable point right now. So I'm going to go ahead and call this video done for the moment because the development environment is up and running. In future videos, we're going to be able to use this development environment. And again, this is the same development environment that I create for many things. I might be using a different library. I might always not use Zend-expressive, but I always pretty much use the same steps that I use this time to get my local environment up and running, whether I'm creating some other application, maybe with Slim PHP or something like that, maybe Zend Framework or who knows. But again, my development environment is always pretty much this way. And that's why I wanted to get this documented. I wanted to get it out here in a video because now I can always refer back to this from other videos where I say I set up my development environment, go back to my previous video and see how I did that. If you have any questions, please post them down in the comments. Also remember to subscribe. I like seeing that the videos are helping people, and I enjoy this. So please contribute in that way, and I greatly appreciate it. So let me go ahead and I'm going to click back to the intro. Thank you. Take care.